Wolfgang Eduard Schneiderhan was a violinist who was born on May the 28th, 1915 and who died on May the 18th, 2002. He died aged 86, very close in fact to 87. He was an Austrian classical violinist and one-time Nazi party member who managed to reform himself after World War II. Judging by his post-war activity, he did not appear to be intrinsically anti-Semitic, but there is still that question mark hanging over his acceptance of Nazism, beyond what was even asked of him. We'll consider that a little further in the video. In this regard, he stands in contrast with, say, Adolf Busch, for example, who resisted the Nazis virtually from day one, although Busch did have a Jewish colleague who later in fact became his son-in-law, Rudolf Serkin, and so in that respect, it was more easy for Busch to resist the Nazis straight away. And so Schneiderhan was a man of contrasts, a one-time Nazi party member. He later went on to found the Fritz Kreisler Austrian violin competition. As we well know, Fritz Kreisler was a Jew. As a musician, he gave the premiere performances of a number of important works, including Karl Amadeus Hartmann's Concerto Funèbre, and in 1947, the Viennese premiere of Elgar's Violin Concerto. Schneiderhan was celebrated, particularly in the German-speaking countries, for his musicianship and stylish, thoughtful performances and recordings of the Viennese repertoire. But he was also celebrated in the UK, at least, as demonstrated by obituaries in UK newspapers at the time of his passing. The violinist and sometime conductor Wolfgang Schneiderhan was a highly versatile artist, just as much at home in the music of Hans Werner Henze as in the music of Beethoven, Mozart and Schubert. Never quite a household name, he was nevertheless active in every aspect of Austria's music scene, and was widely admired for the depth of his interpretative abilities. He was also a dedicated teacher of the violin. Throughout his long career, he appeared as a soloist with most of the great conductors, and as a recitalist with many of the most celebrated pianists of the era. He was very musically mature, which is reflected in the fact that whilst still only a teenager, he was already appointed to important orchestral and academic teaching posts. Born in Vienna on May the 28th, 1915, Schneiderhan was taught violin by his mother from age 3 and gave his first concert at 5. Given that Schneiderhan's older brother was also a violinist, that suggests that his mother might have been a violinist too. She was certainly a music teacher and played a central role in fostering his skills. Schneiderhan was recognised as a child prodigy from the age of 5. The early exposure to violin that he had quickly revealed signs of exceptional aptitude, as Schneiderhan could reproduce intricate melodies from memory after minimal auditory exposure, a trait noted by family observers as indicative of innate musical instinct. Wolfgang Schneiderhan came from a musical family, therefore, where the siblings were encouraged to play the violin by their mother. At 8 years old, he was taken on as a pupil by the great technician and study author Otakar Ševčík in Písek, Czechoslovakia. And his next teacher, the Viennese Julius Winkler, from 1925, was known for his interpretative perceptions and was regarded by Schneiderhan as the key to his development. Winkler's teaching countered Ševčík's intensity by stressing interpretative depth and artistic expression over sheer dexterity. With Ševčík, his method involved systematic drill-based exercises, prioritizing mechanical precision and speed to forge unassailable technical foundations. And so Schneiderhan had a good balance with those two opposing styles of teaching. We know that Jan Kubelik was a student of Ševčík and a big fan of his. Schneiderhan, though, once said that Ševčík was like a man obsessed who wanted to make a Paganini out of every one of his pupils, and that he drilled rather than taught. And so there were these two contrasting pedagogies of Ševčík's technical absolutism versus Winkler's musical humanism. Perhaps because of these contrasting experiences, Schneiderhan eventually became the most classical of all Austrian violinists. At age 10, he publicly performed Bach's Chaconne in D minor. In 1926 in Copenhagen, he played Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, and with that performance, his professional career had begun, aged 11. He subsequently toured Europe and was hailed as a prodigy. He lived in England for some time from 1929, where he appeared in concerts with artists such as Maria Juritsa, Fyodor Chaliapin, Jan Kipura and Paul Robeson, so no doubt he must have been able to speak English quite well. However, the fast money life of a touring virtuoso demoralised the young violinist, and he turned his career in a new direction with the help of a recommendation from an aristocratic patroness. He then became concertmaster of the New Vienna Symphony Orchestra. The amazing thing was, this was in 1933, when Schneiderhan was only 17 years old. And so he helped establish leadership standards for the newly reorganised ensemble, contributing to its technical cohesion during a period of institutional flux in Austrian orchestral life. In 1936, he formed the Schneiderhan String Quartet with Otto Strassner, Ernest Moravec and Richard Kroschak. This quartet, which existed until 1951, was admired by none other than Richard Strauss himself, who regularly attended its concerts and in 1942 entrusted it with the first performance of the sextet from Capriccio. Then 4 years after joining the first orchestra, in 1937 he moved on to the same post with the Vienna Philharmonic, where he served under the great conductors Wilhelm Furtwängler and Hans Knappertsbusch. He led this orchestra for 14 years until 1951, which spanned the orchestra's most turbulent years, including World War II and the post-war reconstruction period. His tenure at the Philharmonic provided continuity in the string section, where as leader he directed rehearsals and influenced phrasing and intonation, fostering the ensemble's signature precision and blended timbre evident in recordings from the era under conductors such as Wilhelm Furtwängler. And thus the Philharmonic sustained international acclaim beyond 1945. He joined the Wiener Staatsoper Orchestra for a brief period between 1937 and 1938. And then in 1951 resigned as leader of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, opting to dedicate himself to solo recitals and chamber music, rather than administrative orchestral duties. This decision reflected a preference for intimate musical collaborations, such as his piano trio with Edwin Fischer and Enrico Mainardi from 1949 to 1956, following Georg Kulenkampff's death in 1948. During the 1940s, he performed duo sonatas with Wilhelm Backhaus and other top-rank soloists. When he was just 19 years old, still a teenager therefore, he took on a teaching role at the Hochschule für Musik in Vienna, where he kept links throughout his life. He also taught at the Salzburg Mozarteum between 1938 to 1956. In 1948, Wolfgang married Irmgard Siegfried, who was a soprano, and the couple often performed together during the course of their 40-year marriage. The couple's shared immersion in classical music fostered a household centred on performance and rehearsal, as evidenced by documented joint preparations for concerts, such as those in Hamburg during the 1960s. Siegfried's vocal repertoire complemented Schneiderhan's instrumental focus, and with his wife Irmgard, Wolfgang performed works such as Henze's Ariosi, including its first performance at the Edinburgh Festival. Schneiderhan was what I would term a Nazi musician. This is because he joined the Nazi Party in 1940, going beyond what he would have been required to do or forced to do. So throughout this time he was able to maintain his career as a soloist in concerts and recordings. His career in fact flourished under the Nazi regime, and in 1944 he was included on the list of God-gifted artists, the Gott Begnadeten-Liste, considered crucial to the Reich. And so he was featured on Goebbels' list of the Reich's most important artists in 1944. In 1946, he was rehabilitated and resumed his career almost immediately, and went on to have quite a prominent international career as both soloist and teacher. So to counter his Nazi Party membership, what can we say to help redeem Schneiderhan? Well, he drew from idols such as Fritz Kreisler and Joseph Joachim. In fact, he later named Austria's first international violin competition after Fritz Kreisler. This Fritz Kreisler competition was founded by Schneiderhan for young violinists at Vienna's concert house. Now we know that Kreisler was Jewish, so that begs the question, was Schneiderhan a real Nazi at heart? Was he anti-Semitic? Or did he just display a cowardly trait of so many other people during the Third Reich, because he was primarily concerned about surviving under the regime and being able to carry on as a celebrated artist? No doubt, in Nazi Germany and Austria, being an official member of the Nazi Party conferred certain privileges and benefits. So what do you think? Was Wolfgang Schneiderhan a real Nazi or just an opportunist? Let me know your thoughts on this matter in the comments. The Viennese tradition of violin playing was important to Schneiderhan, and he was very conscious of his inheritance. But these are the famous names that he would quote: Joseph Joachim, Leopold Auer, who was in Vienna before he started the Russian school, and most famous of all, Fritz Kreisler, all three Jews. With Kreisler, Schneiderhan would point out that he was not only a great violinist, but also a philanthropist, who was always ready to champion a worthy cause. It was gratitude to this very fine man, in Schneiderhan's own words, that he initiated the first ever Austrian violin competition for young musicians, called the Fritz Kreisler competition. So, do you think that Schneiderhan's love of Jewish players was genuine, or do you think he was doing this to cover up his past? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. To add to that, Schneiderhan joined Yehudi Menuhin as soloist in Bach's Concerto for Two Violins, with Karajan directing the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra. Menuhin, of course, was a Jew. So on the face of it, Schneiderhan did not harbour any sort of lingering anti-Semitism or resentment. Menuhin, of course, was keen on getting the classical music scene back to normal in Germany and Austria in the post-war era. Personally, I think the land has never recovered from destroying its Jewish talent. Why is that? Well, the Jews simply play the best classical music. That's a well-known fact. You can feel free to add your opinion to that as well. But certainly in the violin and piano world, it seems beyond doubt. So Menuhin, in that regard, stood in contrast to violinists such as Isaac Stern and Jascha Heifetz, who never really truly forgave the Germans for their behaviour. Of course, we could say some who admired the Nazis early on no longer did by the end of the war. And we know there are individuals who were members of the Nazi Party, such as Oskar Schindler, whose actions demonstrated that they were behaving in opposition to Nazism. And so Schneiderhan returned to a solo career. An active one at that, featuring performances of core violin repertoires such as Beethoven and Mozart concertos across Europe and beyond. He was the soloist in the Viennese premiere of Elgar's Violin Concerto in 1947. He received an appointment at the Lucerne Conservatory in 1949 on the recommendation of the conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler, where he succeeded the renowned teachers Karl Flasch and Georg Kulenkampff. And so in the period after him resigning his Philharmonic concertmaster post, at age 34, Schneiderhan's solo career took off once again, For many years, he ruled the roost among Deutsche Grammophon's stable of violin soloists. At first, he was identified with the core Viennese classical repertoire, but he later became interested in contemporary music and explored the works of Henze, Stravinsky, and other modern composers. His recording of Henze's violin concerto with the English Chamber Orchestra was released on the composer's 70th birthday. Schneiderhan was also associated with Frank Martin, whose concerto he recorded with the composer conducting, and collaborated with Hans Werner Henze and Frank Martin on new works. Frank Martin's Magnificat of 1968 was dedicated to Wolfgang Schneiderhan and his wife. He co-founded the Lucerne Festival Strings in 1956 and also taught at the Lucerne Music Academy, founded together with his own pupil, Rudolf Baumgartner. And so he had a long-term association with Switzerland. He gave the 1959 premiere of his friend Karl Amadeus Hartmann's revised Concerto Funèbre. Schneiderhan and his wife also premiered Rolf Liebermann's Capriccio, as well as Frank Martin's Magnificat and Maria Triptychon, all of which were written especially for them. His solo appearances often highlighted technical precision and interpretative depth, with tours extending to regions including South Africa by the 1970s. Some would say that his establishment of the Fritz Kreisler Austrian Violin Competition perpetuated the lineage of Viennese violin artistry from figures like Kreisler and Joachim, even though the grandfathers of that were all Jewish, for the most part. When you read about Schneiderhan, often this word dry pops up in several places, and so it's said that Schneiderhan had a slightly dry, sober approach to music making, which perhaps made him more readily identifiable with a German tradition. He was conscious, though, of the rich Viennese legacy, Joachim Auer, Kreisler, whom Schneiderhan revered and after whom he named the competition. In September 1952, he made his benchmark Deutsche Grammophon recordings of all 10 Beethoven violin sonatas with Wilhelm Kempff in the Concerthaus Mozartsaal in Vienna. Schneiderhan produced an extensive body of commercial recordings primarily for Deutsche Grammophon, emphasizing works by Mozart, Beethoven and Brahms. A landmark recording was his Beethoven Violin Concerto with Wilhelm Furtwängler, noted for its historic depth. Similarly, his complete cycle of Mozart's violin sonatas, recorded in the 1960s with pianist Carl Seemann, captured the composer's gallant style through precise phrasing and balanced dialogue, and was released in compiled form by Deutsche Grammophon in 2010. Schneiderhan also recorded all 5 of Mozart's violin concertos, often with the Berlin Philharmonic, and other highlights include 1950s studio concerto recordings, later compiled featuring Vivaldi's Four Seasons with the Festival String Lucerne under Rudolf Baumgartner, and other works, emphasizing also his Baroque virtuosity with minimal romantic inflection. His original compositions for Mozart's and Brahms's concertos, he composed cadenzas for those works, as well as his transcribing of the Beethoven's piano cadenzas, originally from Beethoven's own piano reduction of the Violin Concerto Opus 61 for violin performance. It showcases composition skills. And so in other words, Beethoven wrote cadenzas for his violin concerto, but only for his transcription of it for piano and orchestra, not for the actual violin work. So Schneiderhan took these cadenzas from the piano version, Opus 61A, and transformed them back into cadenzas for the violin concerto. Beethoven did not write cadenzas for the original violin concerto, leading other composers and virtuosos to create their own alternatives for the violin. So we could add to the Joachim and the Kreisler cadenzas the Schneiderhan cadenza, although I don't believe Schneiderhan's cadenzas are widely performed today. What about Schneiderhan as a conductor? In the 1970s, he undertook yet another twist to his career. After studying with Hans Swarovski, he became active as a conductor. In 1975, he led a performance of Franz Schmidt's Notre Dame at the Vienna Volksoper. Much in demand as a teacher, in his later years, Schneiderhan continued to live in Vienna, where he died on May the 18th, 2002, just 10 days before his 87th birthday. His wife had died earlier in 1988. They had 3 daughters, including actress Mona Siegfried, who uses her mother's maiden name professionally. Since his death, many of Schneiderhan's recordings have appeared in archival reissues on such labels as Deutsche Grammophon, BBC Legends and Orfeo. Among these in 2019 was his recording of Schubert's piano trios with cellist Boris Pergamenshikov and pianist Paul Badura-Skoda. Some criticisms of Schneiderhan? In comparison to peers, Schneiderhan's restraint stands against the intensity of Jascha Heifetz, whose Beethoven concerto rendition conveys fiery passion and glamour, while Yehudi Menuhin often infused greater emotional depth and variability. Schneiderhan's versions prioritised structural clarity over dramatic flair, and have been seen as templates for sanitised interpretations, but critiqued for insufficient visceral impact on modern auditory evaluation. In terms of his philosophy, he always considered it important for any young musician to spend some time in an orchestra, regardless of soloist ambitions. He would say, "It teaches you to listen. How long the wind and brass have to breathe. It's like playing in a string quartet. The benefits are slightly different, but complementary." Teaching was also a very important part of Schneiderhan's musical life. He was appointed professor at the Hochschule für Musik in Vienna and continued to teach there until the 50s. He was also active as a teacher at the Salzburg Mausoleum from the 30s to the 50s and succeeded Carl Flesch at the Lucerne Conservatory in 1949, continuing to give the masterclasses previously made so popular by Flesch. And it was here, together with his pupil, that he founded the Lucerne Festival Strings. Schneiderhan's older brother Walter was also a violinist. In conclusion then, Wolfgang Schneiderhan was never a firework virtuoso, but he did have prodigious talent. A fine, thoughtful violinist and a great stylist with an individual recognisable tone and delivery, he was acclaimed for his talent, orchestral leadership and refined interpretations rooted in the Viennese tradition. Indeed, he was especially known for his performances of the Viennese Repertoire, writing cadenzas for Mozart's concertos, adapting the cadenzas for violin from Beethoven's own piano transcription of the violin concerto. Though these are today considered only a curiosity, they fascinated Schneiderhan and he was determined to make them familiar, and he made numerous attempts to adapt the material from its pianistic form, trying to make it as suitable as possible for the violin. And so he was determined to preserve the thematic contents of Beethoven's writing and also to keep the technical difficulties of the cadenzas. Schneiderhan prioritised stylistic integrity over showmanship in an era of rising technical display. In this sense, he is perhaps similar to Adolf Busch, it could be said, in style. He emphasised clarity of phrasing and tonal purity over romantic expressiveness or virtuosic display. He avoided lush vibrato excess, privileging a slightly dry quality that underscored melodic lines in core classical repertoire. He was at his best in his element when he was interpreting German works, notably the Beethoven Violin Concerto and works by Mozart and Schubert. The violinist and teacher Wolfgang Schneiderhan was perhaps not considered a great virtuoso, But his performances were always distinguished by a stylish superiority and balanced artistry. He was also known for giving some excellent performances of contemporary work. He once said, "Music does not stop with Debussy or Respighi. Modern music will only die if it is not good music." Interestingly, Schneiderhan has about 8.6 thousand monthly listeners on Spotify as of early 2026. I suspect, though, that perhaps most of those listeners live in Germany or Austria. And I'll conclude this video with a short slideshow of Schneiderhan's Stradivarius violins.
Greatest joy.